Okay, we are going live. And we're live. I'll keep scanning for board members. I hope everyone remembered that the meeting is at 7. But we have some time.
It appears that Betty Ann, Robin, and Greta have their video, and I guess there's Betty Ann. I guess Robin and Greta have their video, and they're off and they're muted.
Yep. If you are having issues getting your video or sound on, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just assume that you have yourself muted and off until we get closer to the meeting start time.
I did send out a few reminders that the meeting started at 7.
We have Abby now. Okay.
Hello.
Hi there.
Hi, Abby.
Hello, how are you?
There you are.
Good.
Hello, Abby.
Hello. How's it going?
Good. How you doing?
Good. Just FYI, I'm gonna be muting a lot so you guys don't hear the kids screaming in the background.
Listen, I'll probably do that too when my dogs start barking.
Okay, so we're just waiting on Meg. Oh, that was perfect timing. She just joined. Okay, Robin and Greta, are you guys there? Whoa. Whoever just spoke, I think your microphone's a little funky. Oh.
Thank you.
Christy.
Hi, Frank. How are you?
Good.
I just had to leave a friend's happy. I didn't have any cocktails, but I just had to leave a friend's happy hour to join this.
Yeah, my office had a virtual happy hour wine tasting going on Zoom.
Oh, really? Yeah. No,
For this.
it was sad. I have to admit, I was a little sad to leave. I was like, well, I'm off to a meeting for 5 hours. I'll see you all later.
Hopefully not 5 hours.
Usually about 5 hours.
Yes, I know. I remember.
At least you didn't have to drive.
True, it's true.
But we are live on LMC TV, just so everyone knows.
Out.
Stop talking about drinking before the.
A quick appearance by my cat. Say goodbye, George. All right.
Okay.
Well, as long as my charger, the phone doesn't lose power, we're good. I mean my phone, my laptop. As long as there's enough power on my laptop.
Hello, Robin.
Hello. I hope everybody's well. So are we on public communication as of this moment?
Yes.
Yes, we are. We're being broadcast.
Are we counting down? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6.
Good job, Greg. You got everybody on the Zoom. We're all here.
Yeah. Thank you.
He's a professional now.
Yeah. This will be the third meeting.
This is about your like 6th hat at the village. You're now the Zoom IT.
Yeah. Well, I do owe a lot of credit to our actual IT person for running through all the features with us.
It's 7 o'clock.
Greg, let me know when we're beginning so I can start.
Yep, we're ready. We're already live on LMC TV, so whenever you'd like to start.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first online meeting of the Mamaroneck Zoning Board of Appeals. I hope everyone who's listening or watching is healthy and stays healthy. for however long and forever long. Okay, so tonight Greg Cutler, the village planner, is going to explain how the Zoom meeting will work and how this online meeting will operate.
Thank you. So first off, I'd like to advise anybody who is watching this from home on LMC TV that you can actually interact with the meeting. If you go to the Village of Mamaroneck website and then go to the planning department page, we have a link to this available, and we will be taking public comment if you actually log into Zoom. The way that we'll be running public comment is we'll be asking you to use a feature in the app. It's on the bottom of your screen and it says raise your hand or raise a hand. When you click that icon, it'll notify everyone that you're trying to make a public comment, and then I'll unmute you and we'll go one by one, unmuting any members of the public to make their public comment. So if you want to try and raise your hand and use that feature now, if you're one of the attendees, please feel free to do it. So we can get a sense of how many people can figure this out. Okay, good. We got a couple people. That's a decent start. We got 4 or 5. Good. Aside from that, just a quick plug for the census. Yesterday was Census Day. We ask all residents to go and fill out your census form at census2020.gov. And that's it. Oh, wait, one more thing. I'm sorry. If you want to make a public comment and you're calling in by phone, because you can also call in by phone, please just shoot me an email at gcutler@vomny.org. Or if you're having any technical troubles joining the meeting, send me an email at that same email address. It's gcutler@vomny.org. And that's it.
Okay, so this is for the board members. Greg is going to control the public speaking and the applicants, but we can't speak at the same time, obviously, to speak over each other. So I'm not sure what the best practice is. There's a couple of choices. I'm thinking that what we'll do is I will, just to make it, kind of proceed at a reasonable rate so that we don't try and speak over. So what I was thinking of doing is I'll introduce the application, the applicant will come up, and then we'll just go in order. I'll just call everyone's name and we'll just go in order. And if you have questions, you raise them there and we'll see if that works. Does that seem to work for all of you? Unless you have another better thought, I'm willing, I'm okay. Okay, so the first application tonight, we're not doing the approval of minutes yet. We're going to start with the public hearing. So the first application is 31A/2019, Dominic Brescia for Capetta Inc., 172 East Prospect Avenue. Is the applicant here? And does the applicant wish to speak?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. Good evening, Chair, members of the board. Christy Adana from Silverberg Zelantis on behalf of the applicant. Also here this evening, hopefully somewhere, is Dominic Brescia for the applicant. Before I begin, I just want to wish you all well during this time and thank you to the board, your staff and the consultants for arranging to hold the meeting in this format. We're back before you tonight because at the March meeting, the board suggested that in lieu of treating our application as a variance, that we make a submission to the board that based upon the circumstances of this project, Capetta is vested in the prior zoning and the new zoning text amendments adopted by the village board in August 2019, and specifically with respect to the fair and affordable housing units, do not apply to this project. We made that submission on March 16th, 2020, outlining in detail why we believe it is appropriate for the board to make such a finding, which is authorized to do under the zoning code and New York Village law. And just to reiterate at the outset, nothing about this project is changing from what was originally approved. All we are requesting is the ability to go forward with the construction that has already commenced on the approved project. So I know most of you have heard this before, but not in the context of the vesting discussion. So I'm just going to briefly recap the history of this project, which started in early 2018 with an application to the planning board. There were originally 2 alternate proposals. One was for the approved design, which was 18 units of loft style designs, which are more expensive and less units than would otherwise be permitted under the zoning code. The other was a 21 unit design, which would have also been zoning compliant, but it would have just been more straightforward cookie cutter 1-bedroom apartments. The first design, the loft style, would have required variances from the zoning board. And so we appeared before this board in March of 2018 to get a sense from the board to present the project and to see how you felt about it. The board did ultimately prefer the loft style design and also recognize that in keeping the project within your jurisdiction, you would have the ability to make suggestions and propose modifications to the project and also put reasonable conditions on it. So with that guidance, the Capetta did go forward with the more expensive loft style design with fewer units based upon a project budget that would have allowed all of those 18 units to be market rate. The applicant then returned to the zoning board in July 2018 after the planning board issued a negative declaration, and the zoning board did grant the variances with conditions on the use of the common roof deck. If the project goes forward, the applicant would obviously have to comply with. The applicant then went back to the HCZMC for the 3rd time and obtained a consistency determination in September. And the approval included a condition that Capetta remove underground storage tanks that existed on the site due to the prior use of the motor vehicle repair shop, and also do groundwater and soil testing to ensure that there was no contamination. Throughout the course of the project, the applicant also made modifications to the proposal and agreed to certain conditions on the project. For instance, they agreed to purchase 3 general parking permits each year, which is in addition to the 20 parking spaces on site that they were proposing, which is already more than what was required under the code. They also agreed to fund and replace village-owned drainage infrastructure, including 2 drain inlets, 3 drain pipes, and 1 manhole. They also offered to fund the installation. They also agreed to offer to fund the installation of a streetlight approaching the Tompkins Avenue Bridge. And they have actually already made that offer to the village, and also offering to fund the installation of parking signage outside of the building, another offer which has already been made to the village. All of these conditions, which were for the benefit of the public, were agreed to based upon the understood project budget at the time that the applicant was going through this process. After leaving the Harbor Coastal, the applicant did return to the planning board and obtain site plan and special permit approval from the planning board in November 2018, again, subject to numerous conditions. After getting the approvals, the applicant began making plans for construction, including securing construction funding, cutting off utilities, and hiring construction personnel. There were also several requirements Capetta had to complete before a demolition permit could be issued, including having the structure inspected for asbestos and by an exterminator, having the water be reconnected to be used during demolition, and hiring an SOE engineer so that immediately after demolition, they could do the necessary inspections and testing to ensure the integrity of the remaining rear building wall and footings, and prepare expedited engineering plans for the new footings and retaining wall to stabilize the site, which was a very costly endeavor. In July 2018, Capetta attended a meeting, 2019, Capetta attended a meeting with various village officials to discuss this construction parameters, including sequencing of construction vehicles, placement of construction fencing, temporary pedestrian crosswalks, etc. On July 10th, a demolition permit was issued. In reliance upon that demolition permit, which also contemplated removal of the underground storage tanks, Capetta did go forward with demolishing the existing structure and also performed additional site work, which you can see in the photographs that were included in your submission. I don't know if you have access to them. If you want, I can pull up some pictures if I can share my screen, but I'll just go through it for right now.
I just promoted you to panelist, so you can share your screen if you wish.
Sorry, usually it's at the bottom, but I'm not seeing that feature right here.
Yeah, it's being a little wonky. There you go.
Okay, sorry, I lost you for a second. So this is what the property looked like before anything happened to it. This is the existing structure. as you all, I'm sure you all know. This is reconnecting the water, which was required prior to demolition. The demolition of the existing structure, which was complicated, given that there were multiple types of materials, including steel, that were in the existing structure. After the structure was demolished, the applicant had to make repairs to the adjacent garage on the neighboring property because of the close proximity, which they did to the neighbor's satisfaction. They did soil boring tests to ensure the soil could support the foundation to be constructed. They removed the underground storage tanks, which, as you can see, are quite large, as was required by the HCZMC approval. It was also in the planning board approval, and they did the soil testing. And then on August 22nd, Capetta received another permit to pour concrete to construct a reinforced retaining wall, which was needed to stabilize the site after construction. Work began upon this immediately as it was necessary for the safety and the integrity of the site and the public. And this was also a very complex and costly procedure, which had to be done after the building was demolished. Then on August 28th, the village board zoning text amendments went into effect that, among other things, required 2 fair and affordable housing units for the proposed 18 units. This was 20 months after Capetta began the application process, 9 months after it received its last approval, and nearly 2 months after it demolished the existing structure and performed the considerable additional site work I discussed. Again, Capetta engaged in all of these activities at considerable expense and went forward with the more expensive, less dense design based upon the understanding of having market rate units. And significantly, as you were advised by Mr. Cutler back in December, when the village board was contemplating the affordable housing that would be generated by the new zoning regulations, it did not include this property in the calculations. So we originally applied to this board seeking a variance. And at the March meeting, the board was divided as to how to handle the issue of whether it was a variance, as an area variance or a use variance, and as an alternate mechanism to afford Capetta relief, given the unique circumstances of this application. The chair asked if it would be possible for the board to find that Capetta was vested in the prior zoning. Under the code and state law, the board is authorized to make the determination that ought to have been made by the individual charged with interpreting the zoning code. Here, the building inspector. As the building inspector has found that Capetta is not in compliance with the new zoning requirements because it is not providing the 2 fair and affordable housing units, it is within this board's jurisdiction to determine that the code requirements do not apply because Capetta is vested in the prior zoning. And just to be clear, and I've said this to you before, but I think it warrants repeating, Capetta is not opposed to affordable housing and has another project that is before the planning board right now that will provide the required affordable housing. However, the difference in the 2 projects cannot be understated. With the new project, Capetta knew what the requirements were at the outset and could plan accordingly. This was not the case for 172 East Prospect because the requirements did not exist. Capetta is requesting relief from this board under the very unique circumstances of this application, in that it pursued a more expensive design with fewer units, agreed to several conditions that would require making repairs and improvements to the village property at Capetta's expense, and incurred substantial costs in site work, all based upon the project budget that it came up with years ago and before the fair and affordable housing unit requirement existed. Our letter provided case law to support that Capetta has completed substantial construction and incurred substantial expense on this project such that it should be vested in the prior zoning. We also provided language from the Appellate Division 2nd Department, the controlling intermediate appellate court in the state, which we believe is very instructive in this situation. And I'm just going to briefly quote for you. While the general standard in determining vested rights is substantial construction and substantial expenditure made prior to the effective date of the zoning amendment, there is no fixed formula which measures the content of all the circumstances whereby a party is said to possess a vested right. Rather, it is a term which sums up a determination that the facts of the case render it inequitable that the state or the municipality impede the individual from taking certain action. Each case must be determined according to its own circumstances. In this case, and based upon the facts and circumstances I have described, We respectfully submit that it would be inequitable to require Capetta to comply with this new zoning requirement. Therefore, in light of this very unique situation, we respectfully request that the board grant the requested relief as originally suggested by the board at the meeting last month and find that Capetta is vested in the prior zoning. Thank you for your time, and I guess I can stop sharing my video, my screen, unless anyone wants to see any of the pictures again. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
I have several questions for you. Did you have a building permit? You had a demo permit, and maybe what permits did you have? As you were required by the variance to get a building permit within a year. Did you have that building permit within a year?
We had a demolition permit.
Okay, I don't.
Which also provided for the removal of the underground storage tanks.
Okay, second question. Besides, what did you do any in terms of expenditures? Did you do any, you made all these promises to the village, right? You said you made all these promises. Did you do any of that work or just the work related to the site specifically?
Well, we did make the offer, a binding irrevocable offer to the village to fund the installation of the street light and to also fund the parking signage. So even though the actual money hasn't been spent, we are bound, the applicant is bound by that offer that it made, and the village board has the right to accept it.
If the that was imposed by the planning board?
Correct.
So that may or may not have, we don't know, been imposed regardless of whether you were building this project, since street lights are needed, whether you were building this project or the as of right project, correct?
Yeah, there's no way to know for certain, but you know.
Okay. Yep. All right. Next question. The principle of vesting in New York State requires, what it does is it says it would be inequitable because of the amount of loss that you would suffer if you were required to comply with the code, right? You can look at Putnam Armonk v. Southeast, is maintained only where the property interest is too substantial to justify its deprivation in light of the objectives to be achieved. In such cases, the right to a non-conforming use is termed vested and will not be disturbed where enforcement would cause serious loss to the owner. So my question for you is, if you were forced to, if the board did not find that you vested and the board did not agree to grant you a variance, an area variance, for whatever reason, and you had to build an as of right project, what serious loss would you suffer from that result?
Well, the costs that have already been incurred in furtherance of this project and having to go back and redesign everything, possibly have to go back in for alternate approvals if that was required by the village, and have to basically start from scratch and go back to the drawing board.
So it's your soft costs that would be affected because you would have had to demolish anyway. Presumably you'd have had to build a retaining wall anyway, and you'd have had to remove the storage tanks. All of that would have had to been done, whatever your work you're doing on this project, correct?
Yes.
So you would, soft costs get considered in connection with a common law vesting. I just want to understand. So those are the costs. So your lost costs would be your soft costs incurred in doing this project compared to, and then you'd have to incur new soft costs, but the hard costs would be this that you spent, you still get those same hard costs, correct?
I can't necessarily speak for how the construction would have proceeded under
That's not the question.
Project or a different design.
The question isn't how the construction would have proceeded. The work you did was you did demo, which you'd have had to do anyway. You removed storage tanks, which you'd have had to do anyway, and you put up a retaining wall, which relates to the property, not to the building. So you'd have had to do that anyway. Wait, am I missing something in terms of what you did in terms of hard costs? I could be. I'm not saying I just want to make sure I have them all. Is there any other hard costs?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Okay, those are that's what I have for now. Let's go with the rest of the board. Starting from the end, assuming we were sitting. Greta, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question, and I guess it's directed to the village attorney. Is the village attorney here?
Yeah.
Here, yeah.
Okay. Because as I recall, the applicant originally tried to get the project to go forward based on this vesting concept. A memo was presented to the village attorney, and the village attorney rejected the vesting issue. So I'd like to understand why, from the village perspective, the vesting issue was rejected.
So I didn't draft that. That was drafted by Bob Spolzino. So I can take a look at it quickly and let you know. If you give me a couple minutes, perhaps if we move on with panelists, then I'll take a quick look at his memo if I can locate it.
If I could just speak to that briefly, because I did have the communication with Mr. Spolzino. And yes, we were forthright with the board at the outset of this process that we had those communications. We did present these circumstances to the village attorney, and the response was that he did not believe we had vested. And so that was why we proceeded with the variance application. However, I do not believe, at least I never saw a written memorandum from Mr. Spolzino to that effect. It was me submitting something to him and then a phone call after the fact. So I'm not sure if Ms. Mason is going to find anything.
Well,
And the reason,
I just want to have an understanding why, what legal principle the village attorney used to reject the vesting concept.
So again, that's something that I'll try and locate it quickly. If I
Okay.
can't find it, I can perhaps, I mean, if this continues, I can address it at the next meeting. But in the meantime, I'll take a quick look and see if I can locate a memo. Bob had mentioned that he might have written something on it, and this was earlier today. Again, I haven't. I didn't find it earlier, so I will look in other places now. But I'll circle back in a few minutes.
Doesn't exist.
Anything else, Greta?
No, that's it.
I don't remember. Did we get a memo? I didn't remember seeing it.
No, we didn't.
Oh,
didn't get-
okay. Okay, Meg.
Hi, all. Yes, Robin, you mentioned, you asked if they had ever gotten a building permit prior to the regular season. And actually, I'd like to point out that in the resolution for the variances, the two variances that the ZBA did approve for this project, which were about the number of stories and the FAR, it said in that resolution that you had a year to get a building permit and to complete construction, which does sound pretty short, but it's in the resolution. If you read the language.
Let's say complete construction.
It's a year to get the permit and then a year after the permit to complete construction.
Okay. You had a year to get the permit, and as we just heard, you did not get the building permit. So as I'm reading it, those two variances have lapsed. So you would need to apply for those two variances again. Also, Christy, in your explanation, you kept referring to substantial construction costs. And I would like to reiterate, I think where Robin was going, that you incurred costs to prepare the property, but I see that there were substantial construction costs. And most of what I'm reading about vesting rights, it's about how much of the project you actually built or constructed, what percentage of the foundation or other, and how much of that cost. And it seems everything was to prepare this property to go many different ways, could have many different kinds of projects. I'm interested that originally you went to the village and inquired about vested rights and were not successful. At least Spolzino did not see it that way. So you then applied for variances, for the two variances for the height and for the affordable housing units. But you had the choice at the time to ask for an interpretation or to come to us for vested rights then as to why the village was not granting you vested rights. Instead, you applied for the variances. In my mind, that's generally agreeing that you didn't have vested rights and that you needed the variances, it does seem that it's more than 60 days past the date of the notice you got from the building department. And so you've timed out of being able to use this argument for vested rights. So I would like the board to consider that. And
I'm sorry.
yeah. Would you like to?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
It's okay. But basically that's it. And most of what I've been reading about vested rights, it does have to do with how much you spent in terms of the percentage of the entire project cost, or how much of a percentage of the building has been constructed. In weighing, absolutely, I understand the language that there's no exact equation, but that's generally the measures that are used by boards to understand what is this.
If I could just respond to some of those comments. We raised this issue to the board in response to comments that were made by the board last month. In our initial submission, we did indicate that it was our belief that we were vested. However, the village attorney had disagreed. We did appeal within 60 days, and this board is always within its right to issue an interpretation based upon a determination by the building inspector. Under village law, it says that a use variance can be granted on appeal from the decision or determination of the administrative officer. It says the same thing with respect to area variances. There's no such requirement that it be on appeal for an interpretation. We're here before you and the interpretation is before you. And therefore we would submit that even now, it is still within the board's right, especially where the board last month was the one what raised this as a possible avenue, that you would not be precluded from making this finding under the circumstances. And while the law hasn't caught up to the times. And that's why the equitable nature of this is so significant, because years have gone into this. You know, you don't just pull a building permit anymore. You go through a year-long land use review process. You go to multiple boards over multiple months, paying consultants fees on both ends, and you try to do the best you can and you try to plan ahead. And that's what they tried to do based upon what was in front of them at the time, which did not include this requirement for a fair and affordable housing unit. And, you know, I understand it's the soft cost. It's also what they've agreed to do as part of the project that should be considered as well.
Just to follow up, in July, when you were hitting the or getting the building permit, why did you not apply for a building permit? I know you have another project going on in the village. I would assume that you understood that the new regulations were being considered and were going to be voted on. Why did you not apply for the building permit? Because in my mind, without actually getting the building permit, it actually wasn't approved to be constructed. You received a lot of approvals, site plan approval, you received variance approval, but it does take the building department to sign off on a building permit for you to be considered that you had the right to build the building. And then, so if you don't have that, then I don't see how you have vested rights in building the building, because you never actually got the absolute right, since you didn't get the building permit.
Well, there was a lot that had to be done prior to that being issued, including the demolition of the existing structure. I understand that these are things that would have happened for any project at this site, but they're not issues that would have been encountered on any site. If we were dealing with a vacant lot where there were no underground storage tanks, where you weren't abutting against an adjacent building that needed an immediate retaining wall that had to be constructed on an expedited basis in order to stabilize the site, those are all things that were unique to this site. And if they hadn't existed, we very well may have been able to get a building permit. And just to also clarify, there's been a foundation permit pending since September that we've been trying to work through with the village. So it's not for lack of trying.
Let me
post.
Oh, sorry, Meg, finish. If you have more questions, please go.
It's just that the September permit application is post the date for starting construction.
What I was going to say, just something too, with respect to the issue of the building permit, not with respect to the issue of whether the variance is lapsed, that's a different question, but just with respect to needing a building permit, there is case law that says you don't necessarily need a building permit. And there's also a lot of case law that says vested rights acquired by clearing and grading the building site, commencing excavation. So you don't need to have actually done, there's a lot of case law out there and you don't need to have done the construction.
And as we discussed, there's also a lot of case law where they found exactly what happened with a building coming down, retaining wall, water, tanks being taken out, and it wasn't considered. There was no building permit, there was no start to construction, and the project was not considered to have vested rights. So it goes.
It doesn't go, the case law is stronger on one side, but let's not get into a legal discussion. I've written enough memos on this. This is a topic I know something about. That's not, so just with respect to that, but I do think, which is why I asked about the building permit. I do think the building permit issue is a much bigger issue, because if they didn't have a variance, they couldn't have built. And so what should have happened in July is they should have applied for an extension of the permit, is what should have happened. But it didn't happen, and we'll figure this out when we talk. So, okay,
If we're going to continue
Abby?
on, just to finish up, if we are going to go on and consider this with the vested rights, then I do have case law that I would like to share with the rest of the.
Okay, Abby, do you want to ask questions?
No, I think you've all, my central one was around the building permit, which you're all both already discussing, so.
Okay, Doug, anything?
What they've done to the site was actually to prep it. They did the demolition, they put the retaining wall in, they took out the tanks, but in reality, that was a prep of the site. Nothing to do with building construction, seriously. They could have applied for a building permit application, of which they then could have come back and said, we need it extended, but they didn't. So, I understand, Robin, what you indicated. I understand very clearly what Meg indicated. I kind of agree with Meg on this particular issue, but I'm going to take a wait see.
Okay, is there any member of the public who wishes to speak on this application?
I actually have one hand raised.
Okay, wait, when you speak, since we can't see you, please identify yourself clearly, I guess. So that's so we know who you are. And if you, that's enough. Do we need addresses? Is there a reason that we need people to give? Well, we won't have it signed in. The sign-in sheet requires addresses, doesn't it? Betty Ann?
I don't think we can require addresses. But
Okay, then
if
we'll just
someone
require
is willing
names.
to give it,
Okay.
that's fine.
Okay,
Just
so
names
give your
and
name.
their project
Never
of
mind, Betty Ann.
interest.
And if you're a member of the public and you're an attendee, please use the raise your hand feature and I will unmute you. Okay, here we go.
Gotcha. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Hi, this is Penny Chumley, 124 Spruce Street. Good evening. Thanks for having this meeting. I just wanted to, having a ringside seat to this particular project. It is quite literally in my backyard. There are other variances that this development has already requested and received, and now they are in front of this board with yet another variance request. This one being, in my humble opinion, especially in this particular time, particularly egregious, in that they are wanting to build more luxury, high-rise, multifamily units in our village. We've already seen what the development in the village has done to our village and continues to do. And I think that for them to be granted an opportunity to neglect the most critical members of our village, which are people who are working people, who don't make the kind of money that I think they would like to rent these units for. I think that now is not an appropriate time to grant them this variance.
Thank you. Anyone else? Was that it? Oh, no.
Oh, we have one more. Hold on. Okay, you're unmuted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Daniel Newman. I also live on Spruce Street, and I agree with Penny's views there. I mean, like I don't quite understand why they need the variance from those two units, particularly at a time like this.
Thank you. I have a question for the applicant, which I asked, but I didn't really get an answer. If you don't build, which was whether or not you would be reusing all, oh yeah, we did. The cost, you said the cost would all be the soft costs. Okay, so that was it. The only costs that you would have lost, or the cost that you would have lost, would be the soft cost of whatever it would be to design a new structure and go through the application process.
It's the soft costs of starting from scratch if necessary, and also continuing to incur the expensive carrying costs without being able to move forward, because the process has already been going on for so long and we've been trying to work with the village to remedy it. And just to respond to the comments made by the public, we understand where they're coming from. And like I've said before, it's not about not providing affordable housing. We're doing it for the new projects that they're contemplating now and seeking approvals for. It's the timing, and that's really the issue here. And so it's not to say that the applicant doesn't want to provide the housing. It's just they couldn't have planned for that at the time.
You didn't do a calculation of the percentage, right? The case law all deals with what percentage of loss you'd have suffered. You didn't do any of those calculations, did you?
I think we just provided hard numbers.
Right, but you only provided high numbers of what you'd incurred, not hard numbers of the total cost of the project. You know, if you incur $10,000 on a $5 million project, if you incur $100,000 on a $5 million project, that may not be a lot. Whereas if you incur $1 million on a $5 million project, that's a lot. So the size of the project is relevant. So yeah, you didn't give us that. Okay.
I can just tell you that as far as I'm aware, and you know, these numbers may have changed. I think the proposed construction budget was somewhere in the area of, I think around $6 million. And they've already expended well in excess of well over $1 million, probably closer to 2 if you take into account the purchasing of the property, the carrying costs, the soft costs, and the hard costs.
Right, but all those would still be incurred if we deny this application, whether this or the variance, and you have to build something else. They're not lost costs. They're incurred to do this. So what are the lost costs? The lost costs are really your soft costs in applying for this application. There aren't any other costs. The cost of carrying charges you'd have to do anyway.
Well, it would be longer than it needed to be if we have to start all over again.
Okay. Anybody else have any board members? Anything else?
Chair, may I respond to Greta?
Christy, was that you?
Yeah, may I respond to Greta?
Yes.
So there is not a formal memo. It was a conversation that Bob had with the building inspector to let the building inspector know that he felt that substantial construction had not yet been completed. And he is also in agreement with what the chair initially said, some of her questions. I think that points more towards substantial investment. But overall, he felt that it had not been vested. So unfortunately, there is not anything specifically written. If we needed to provide opinion, of course we could. But there is not anything at this time that we can share besides what I just told you.
Thank you. Any other board member? Meg, you have more questions?
Just if we're getting close to closing, I would like to be able to enter into the record that I did find this case law of Exeter Building Corp v. Town of Newburgh. And interestingly enough, Steven Silverberg, which is the managing partners, I believe, of the applicant's firm, actually wrote about this in the blog. Didn't seem to argue with the fact that a case where a building had been demolished, water tanks had been removed, the ground had been leveled, And yet they didn't get a building permit and hadn't started construction. And Steven Silverberg agreed, it seems, in his blog that the project did not have vested rights. And the fact that you have an approved site plan and some other approvals is not enough to have rights. So I would like, I don't know if the attorney for the applicant wants to discuss this Exeter Building Corp v. Town of Newburgh, but I would like to have that as part of our discussion if we're going to be talking about vested rights. Also, Chair, if we're going to go into discussion about this and we decide not, we're in agreement, we don't know yet, but if we do agree not to give them, to see that they have vested rights, and we go back to talking about use variance or area variance, is that where we would be headed? We would be going back to the original application.
Yes.
I'm deviating just a little bit because I think it's important as part of the record and that the applicant is a part of our hearing to discuss topics. I did some more research on whether affordable housing is a use variance or an area variance. I found a lot of litigation where some towns and municipalities actually seem to be trying to prevent affordable housing. And in those instances, they kept talking about whether it was a beneficial use. In many places, they found it was a beneficial use. And they talked about needing a use variance to put it in places where it wasn't zoned. So it seems to be going the opposite way, but I have found a lot of some case law where they are talking about affordable housing as being a use and a benefit to the community. So that's basically Homes for Hope v. East Hampton Township Planning Board. They talked a lot about affordable housing being a beneficial use. And
May I respond? Sorry. With respect to the blog, I cannot speak specifically to what was in that blog. However, my experience with it is that it's a reiteration of what the court found, and generally, again, without having the opportunity to have recently read it, not an opinion, but a way of making known to the public the types of case law and decisions that are coming out. I don't think there's generally heavy argument in those blogs, but again, that's just my experience in the ones I've read in the past. Regarding the cases that you referred to, you know, I think there's a lot of variables that come into play there, such as what the original zoning was for, where the affordable housing was being proposed. Because I think what we've talked about in the past, and at least what I raised, is that a use variance is generally something you see when something is, for instance, commercial, and you want to put something residential there. So I don't know if that was the type of situation that was in those cases, but that's one instance that may come up. And so,
I believe the Homes for Hope, it was one type of residential for a different type of residential.
Chair, could we have those sites for the record from Meg?
Certainly, if we are going to be considering any case, then the board would need to have it, and it would have to be made available to the public so that the applicants could speak to it. So I think since we did discuss, I mean, it's not fair otherwise if they've never looked at these cases. I would say about beneficial use, I'm not sure the fact that a case talks about it as a beneficial use means that it is a use variance versus an area variance. It's talking in some of those cases, and I don't recall the Homes for Hope. I may or may not have ever read it, but a lot of that is talking, you know, because a lot of times what they're doing in those cases is it's applicants asking for multifamily housing in order to provide affordable housing in a place where multifamily housing was not otherwise allowed. Therefore, when you're talking about use, it's a little bit different. I don't know if that's if that's true in Homes for Hope. I haven't read it, so I don't want to imply that it is, but I do think if we're going to be discussing cases, then we should all be able to look at them, although we're not. So I do think we need to be able to look at them if we're going to do that. So I think if Meg, if you want to make to circulate the Homes for Hope site, at least so that, but not everybody can get it. I think you're going to have to circulate the case because I doubt that Doug has ability to get it. I don't know about everybody. I don't know about anyone else, but I certainly doubt that Doug has the ability to get it. I don't know about Greta. Can you get case law? I mean, do you have access to something?
To tell you the truth, I found a lot of discussion of it, so just as a user.
So you didn't read the case?
No, I didn't read the case.
Okay. I think as a practice, the fact that people just, if we're going to refer to cases, and then I think we need to read the case before we start quoting from cases. So I just, and that's fine. If, I mean, I'm not suggesting, I mean, if you've read a case and you think it's relevant, that's great. So like you mentioned the Town of Exeter case. Did you read that case, or you also just read discussion about it?
No, I read the case and then I read the blogs.
Okay, so yeah, my experience with that blog is also that he's just reciting what the decision of the cases are. So I think since I've put in extraneous discussion and you've put in extraneous discussion, that I think we should share the cases, not the blog, because I don't think people's discussions of another case is relevant. It's either the case law, because everybody can interpret cases differently. So I will, after this meeting, share the cases that I mentioned with the other board members, and if we make them available to the public, that's okay too. So if you mentioned Town of Exeter, if you can share that case, please, with the board members, that would be great. Then we would all have the same information, or at least be looking at discussing the same.
Chair, would we be able to get those
In
sites from
addition-
Betty?
Wait, hang on. Greta, did you have something?
No, just, I hate to, in addition, Christy, if you could send the 2 or 3 cases that Bob felt were the most relevant in his determination that the vesting wasn't met, that would be helpful too.
Yeah, I'll speak to Bob and see what the basis is for his analysis. I'm not exactly sure which cases he picked out, but I'll have a conversation with him and I'll provide you any information that he gives me.
Okay, and Doug?
Yes, possibility. Maybe, I know you're going to provide us with the cases, and maybe some of the members don't have access to case law. Is it possible to forward the case law to every board member that's being discussed tonight?
Yeah, that's what I said.
Yeah.
Everybody who mentioned a case will share that case with the other board members,
Yeah,
and also make it available to the applicant.
Okay, that's good. Okay.
Absolutely.
May I say something?
Please.
They talked about the cost, but if you think about it, the cost that they spoke, most of it is associated with the work that they did on the site right now, which would have had to be done no matter what they built. The question comes out, if they had to put in 2 affordable housing units, is that going to change the footprint or the interior of the building? I would believe it would only change the interior layout if they have to provide 2 affordable housing units. I don't think it would require them to modify the footprint of the building. I'd like the attorney to speak on that.
It depends upon whether with the 2 affordable housing units, it's feasible for the applicant to go forward with the plan as currently designed, because as I indicated before, they did propose a more costly loft style design and also fewer units than they otherwise were originally contemplating with 21. So if they do have to go forward with the 2 affordable units, they'll have to reevaluate whether it's feasible to go forward with that design with whatever interior modifications may have to be made, or if they have to redesign it entirely.
My question is, are they going to have to alter the footprint of that building or strictly the interior?
I don't believe
I mean, you can only, let me put it this way. You have a site and you can only build on X amount portion of that site.
I understand. I do not believe the footprint would change.
So the footprint, okay, what would dictate that the footprint of that building on that site would get bigger if you had to put in two affordable housing units?
With respect to
Your-
print, nothing.
Your building footprint I'm discussing.
I don't think it would change.
Okay, so your foundation would probably be the same. Your exterior wall constructions probably would modify slightly. Your cost would occur would be on the interior to allocate for two affordable housing units. Correct?
Well, without knowing what the design is and without having contemplated that and presented it to the village, it's impossible to know what the village would require in terms of amended approvals if the density was increased.
Explain why the density would increase if you're incorporating if two of the units that you have are going to turn into affordable units. Maybe not of the size that you're proposing, maybe smaller.
Because the
But-
applicant was proposing fewer units than it otherwise could have because it contemplated all of them being market rate. If they have to make two of those affordable, then it may be possible that they have to go back to the alternate design with 20 or 21 units in order to cover that cost.
Mhm. But that would impact your parking.
The alternate design that was originally presented to this board, along with the design that was ultimately approved, was zoning compliant as to parking, yes.
Okay, so it's not going to impact your parking,
No,
correct?
no, but it could impact the design of the building.
It could impact the interior design of the building. You've already said that the footprint of that building isn't changing.
Well,
It does.
also affect the height. I mean, that hasn't been designed yet. But if the neg deck was based upon a certain number of units and then those change, it's possible we may have to go back. I don't know. And
Okay,
that's the concern.
all right. I
Okay.
understand.
Oh, sorry. Anybody else from the board have anything else? Anybody else from the public have anything else? I'll give a second for the public.
Chair, would you like a memo? Outlining why we feel.
I'll take a vote of the board. I personally don't need a memo. So if anybody, if the other members of the board think we'd like a memo from council, we'll ask for it. Greta? I guess I'll answer this. If you would like a memo from council on this subject, please, can they raise their hand? Greg, will that work?
That'll work.
Okay, just
Or you
raise
can
your hand,
say
either,
it, yeah.
either, just literally raise your hand so that we can
Yeah,
see it, or
yeah.
press the button. So that's a no.
Okay, so we'll just send you the cases.
Yes, please.
that Bob has. All right.
The applicant has raised his hand. Dominic, you should be able to speak right now.
You hear me? Good
Yeah.
evening. Hi, how are you? You hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Greg. Hi, Robin. Good evening. I just wanted to interject in regards to Doug's question in regards to the footprint will not change at all. It will be exactly the same length by width. What would change is the loft style would have to be removed, and we will have to do a typical style building, which we were trying to avoid, and go up 3 stories, rather, 3 levels. Monetary wise, this is a much more complicated design, superior design, a design that we thought the Village of Mamaroneck would embrace. It's not a cookie cutter that everybody else is doing. There was a lot of thought and back and forth in achieving what we came up with. Going back to a 21 unit, yes, would help us as far as the affordable aspect, but the cost of going back to architects, so on and so forth, and changing all these plans would be another hardship for this project and the carrying costs that go along with it. again, we're just, you know, trying to work with this board for the last 4 to 5 months to come up with a resolution to really see what could be done. Because had we had known, as Christy said, that we were going to be part of an affordable scenario here, we probably would have went to the 21 units, because we had no choice economically and financially, because it already doesn't make sense to do this 18-unit building. To go and move forward and have 2 affordable at this point would just, this would have to go on for about 5 years before we even see any break even. I told Chrissy we'd be happy to share with the board real numbers to show the hardship that it would create in you know, fair market value for the 16 units, and then what we're presumably going to get for the affordable, and you would see that we're in the red. Okay, we could do a quick spreadsheet. Christy got all the numbers already. We have all the backup substantiating that these are all bona fide numbers. You know, we were doing this as a love for going with a different sort of project again. And that's why we ended up with this. So we're just asking this board to be sympathetic to you know, how this truly came to be. Going back to the permit, Frank Tavolacci is there. He's listening. He knows that we've been trying to get this foundation permit for the longest time. The building itself, the retaining wall footings are also part of the building footprint. They act as both, as the old building did. It holds back the wall and it's part of the back of the building. So the permit that they released is a building permit for one portion of that building. And so, look, I mean, we were trying to keep going with the project, but because they knew that the moratorium was soon approaching, they were reluctant months before to release the foundation permit so that we could keep on moving. So, look, I mean, again, we wanted to forge forward, but we were getting hit obstacles, and we couldn't any longer. So, again, to answer Doug's question, physically, construction-wise, it probably would be very close in relation to construction costs, except that the loft style would you know, is a higher end look. But you know, we would also have to change the interior of the building to accommodate many other things. And then again, the soft cost process that we would incur in both time and expenditures from all the design professionals would really put us in a bad spot.
Chair, Penny Chumley is asking to make an additional public comment. Would you like me to allow that?
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks all. Thank you, Greg. I just would like to commend the village for their attention to detail and ensuring that this project, this major project in our village, aligns to the plan for the village, and that there are lots of other opportunities in that space. And to also remind the village that the 21 unit building that the developer refers to has not been before any of the boards as far as approvals. So the conversation, should the design change, is going to need to be re-reviewed. There were actually significant conversations around the look and feel of the luxury 18 units that the developer has proposed. And there are still problems with it. That there needs to be more conversation about this. And I think the larger conversation is, you know, and maybe what it comes down to is we talk about, and I think the developer even himself has just pointed it out, is that I think it's the wrong project for the wrong space. And they went ahead with that purchase of that property and the development of that property at a time when they were getting permits for other things in the village, which we all know about, which would no longer be approved in any way, shape, or form. And I think they may have gotten a little bit ahead of themselves when they bought this property and started this development. I think in the between time, what has happened is that the village has had a moment to take a breath and to realize that the development in this village had gotten way out of control, way more quickly. And I think that, again, the developer just said it himself. This may not be the right property for this project. They may not be able to make money off of it, in which case maybe now is the time to actually change direction. So again, I commend the village for keeping the villagers' best interests front of mind as this project has progressed. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so just proceeding what we're doing. Meg and I will each circulate the cases we discussed. The applicant will prepare and submit information on financials, although I think the bigger question is, honestly, and I know that I suggested that you go for a common law vesting at the time, not knowing whether or not, not having looked into all of this or considered the facts here. But I think a big issue, which is, I think, the fact that if which is the question of two questions, which you might think about for the next meeting, which is, given that there is it reasonable to consider the permit that you got a building permit? Because is it reasonable to consider a building permit that satisfies that requirement? And second, given that the building permit, assuming that it was a building permit that satisfied the requirement, why then but you didn't have it, so assuming that it was a valid permit, but I guess it wasn't because the building inspector didn't consider. Is that why the building inspector didn't consider that you had vested, because it wasn't a building permit? So I think you need to think about that question in your in coming back for next week.
If I may, at the time, my understanding is the building department didn't issue a building permit. It was only for shoring up the site. The reason being that all of the conditions were not met that were required by the planning board at that point.
Right. Thank you. My question is, at some point, so in October, or they couldn't get a building permit, presumably, and so it's a question of how do you deal with that issue of not having, if the variance lapsed because you didn't get a building permit. I think this may be mooted, but if it didn't, or if you're arguing that it didn't lapse for some reason, why didn't it lapse? And I guess you could, and I think that's it. Anything else that we want to hear for the next meeting?
Robin, I should send it to Betty Ann, the cases, and then she'll circulate.
That would work. Great.
Hey, can we ask Frank about the building permit issue?
Sure.
Frank?
Yep, go ahead.
Did they request or put in an application for a building permit?
They put in an application for a demolition permit, which they got, and they started the demolition. They also put in an application for a building permit that we were holding on to until this variance issue was resolved.
If I recall correctly, there was a foundation permit application as well,
Right.
but only the portions that were necessary to stabilize the site were.
What was the date of the applications for the foundation?
No. Well, I have, okay.
I believe it was August 20 something. I'll let the applicant speak to that.
So it was
Wait,
past
get there. Did they, before July of 2019, when the variance would have lapsed, what permits had they applied for and what permits did they have?
We had a demolition permit and to extract the underground storage tanks.
That's what you had. What had you applied for?
I would need to look into that further.
Okay. Frank, can you answer that question?
I mean, just from memory, I think it was just to remove the tanks and to do the demolition. At
All
that
right,
time,
so they had not applied for the permit to put the footing in and shore up the wall.
Of course we did.
Yeah, they
I
Wait,
think they
excuse
did.
me, excuse me, Mr. Brescia, can I have Frank answer that, please?
Yes.
So that's true.
Thank you.
The application was for the demolition and to put up that wall. It was part of,
Okay, but it was to shore up that wall, is that correct?
yes, yeah.
Okay, all right. So even if they're using the footing underneath that wall that they're using for shoring, it was for shoring up that wall, correct?
You know, I can't make the argument whether it's a building permit for the structure or just the shoring up of the wall. That's more for legal people to decide. I just know that they had the permit for the demolition and the retaining wall.
Okay, the retaining wall.
Right, the retaining
Right.
wall.
Retaining/building wall.
Yeah, which was part of which is part of the foundation plan. But
Right.
again,
Yes.
I'm not making that.
Okay, the bigger question is, okay, they could not put up that building without the retaining wall up first. Is that correct?
The retaining wall absolutely had to go
Actually,
up
is a-
first. It had to go.
Yes, it
Because
had to
it,
go up first, right?
right, because
okay.
it had to protect that site, because you had
Right.
buildings on top of that that were putting pressure that, you know, it had to be addressed.
That was a safety issue.
It was a safety issue, yeah.
Right.
And the
okay.
whole permit wasn't issued because of certain conditions on the planning board approval. Again, just to
Right.
reiterate.
Okay. All right. So there were outstanding planning board issues that need to be resolved before they could be issued a building permit,
That's correct.
correct?
Yes.
Right, Greg, that's correct?
Yes,
Okay,
that's
thank
my
you.
understanding. I'd like to go and look back at the record before.
No, I mean, I would
confirming
like
that,
to,
but-
yeah, I would like to see that record. Can you make that part of the submission to us?
We can try to address that timeline.
Right,
The applicant tried to move as quickly as possible. They didn't get the last approval until November of 2018 and had demolished the structure by the following July. So that's a pretty short time frame to put all that together. And then they went forward with, like we were discussing, the retaining wall that is part of the foundation and is the rear wall that is going to be part of the structure that will be constructed.
okay. No, I got that. I'm more interested in the timing that occurred.
Chair. There was a building permit application 17-0641, and that is in the record in the system for the construction of a new building with 18 one-bedroom units and on-site parking. And that is dated December 18th, 2017.
So Betty Ann, was that the first submission before they go to planning board? Because we require a building permit application before you even start the site plan process.
That is correct.
Okay.
And then they did receive the demolition permit, which the application date on that I'm seeing as June 18, 2019 for the demolition and removal of the existing, it says existing building and removal of 2 underground storage tanks. And then we have the application for the construction of the rear retaining wall. And let me just pull up this one last application that is open. It's an application number 19-0430 for the installation of footings and foundation as per approved plans. And that is dated September 30th, 2019.
Okay. Okay, so I think we know what we want. Unless there's anything else, we'll move on. Okay, this application is complete. Everybody knows what needs to happen for the next meeting. And so this is adjourned.
Chairman? Hello?
Thank you for your time this evening.
Chairman Christie? Hello?
Hello?
We hear you.
Hey, Greg, I just want to ask the chair one more question, if possible. So I'm just trying to understand if when we go to this next meeting, we'll get the case study, so on and so forth. But what can we just talk out loud and can you let us truly know exactly what the next steps are going to be here to come to some sort of a conclusion with this?
I think at the next hearing, the next time we'll close the hearing, and whatever you show, whatever everybody else shows, and the hearing will be closed, I think, at the next meeting. I don't think there's any more information we're going to need on this, unless something brand new comes up. But I would expect that the hearing would be closed, at which point we would vote on two things. We would vote on whether or not to grant you the common law vested rights application. If we agree that you are vested, then that would be the end of it. If we do not believe that you are vested, then we would go back to the area variance application and make our decision on that. I don't mean the area variance, I mean the fair and affordable housing unit area variance that you have requested, to whether or not we will grant that. I think that's what we would do.
And Chair, what about the two lapsed variances? Would they have to reapply for the two that have lapsed?
Well, they've applied for them. They've already applied for them. We gave them at the last meeting the height variance, and we gave them, and that was the variance they needed. So we reissued that already.
No, I believe the first two that we gave for was FAR and the 4 stories for the law.
That was yes, and we reissued at the last meeting.
Did we? Did we do the okay.
Not the FAR.
I don't recall the FAR.
It was just the
We didn't do
height.
the FAR, so they didn't reapply for the FAR?
This
Christie?
wasn't something that had previously come up at any point in time. We had demolished the structure. We were moving forward with everything. And then we made the application to this board, and at no point prior to tonight was there ever any suggestion that the prior variances had lapsed.
Oh. The height variance was a new variance, right, on the new zoning.
And the letter that we got for the applicant was for 2 additional variances, affordable housing and height. It didn't refer to the last 2 that we had already.
So that is a question for the building department in the first instance. Because you're going to have to make the decision as to whether or not those variances lapsed. If they lapsed, then they need new ones for that. So, I mean, I was assuming that they had not. Sorry, I apologize. I did mix it up, but I was assuming they had not lapsed. But we now seem to find that maybe they did, because there was no building permit. So the issue is whether or not there was a building permit issued, in which case they didn't lapse. But if it wasn't, then they did lapse. So we're in a different place.
Yeah, and we should check the conditions to make sure it's applied for building permit versus secured building permit.
Right, the question is, it says a building permit. What is a building permit? That's where we have come from. So I think the building department needs to make the determination as to whether or not a building permit was issued.
I would say that they already made that determination, because the denial letter that was issued in November only raised the issue of the 2 new variances. There was nothing raised with respect to the prior variances, which would have been included in the denial letter if it was the building department's position that those variances had lapsed.
Right. Yeah, I'm looking at my notes, man. That's true. Yep. Okay.
At the end of the day, it's up to the building department to make that determination. So, building department, if you would please confirm that that in your view, a building permit was issued, so the variance didn't lapse, or the other way around. You don't have to answer it now, Frank. You will need to give us an answer between now and the next meeting.
Okay. Agreed.
Anyway, to Mr. Brescia, so there goes your answer. So now we have a new possibility. So I go back to what I said. There are 3 possibilities of what can happen at the next meeting. Maybe 3, let's start. 1, if the building inspector determines that in fact they erroneously issued the objection, i.e. they forgot to say your prior variance lapsed, then you would need to apply for new variances to get that variances that you previously got again. So we'll know that at the next meeting. So assuming if in fact the prior variances had lapsed, then you would need to reapply for them. So you'd have to put that time back. So that's what would happen. And that would happen, but let me point out that that's relevant whether or not we decide to give you vested rights, or maybe relevant to our decision as to whether or not to give you vested rights. But it's certainly also relevant to the question of whether or not, because even if we decided to give you an area variance, we decided no vested rights and we gave you an area variance for this, if those prior variances had lapsed, you'd have to reapply for those prior variances. So that does, just letting you know where we are. So that's an additional to what I previously said, was we would either decide you have vested rights and or make a decision on the variance. But now we have a third thing, which is possibly also determine that you need to reapply for the 2 variances. So I understand this is something you had not been aware of. So I'm going to ask the building inspector if he can make that decision as soon as possible, because if it is that the applicant needs to apply for the 2 new variances, he may want to rethink what he wants to do rather than go through the process some more, since we haven't even decided these. So I think that's where we are. Okay. Christy, yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Moving on to the next application.
Greg, I'm recused on this, so can you mute me and block me?
Okay, so Lori Lee is here, right? Okay.
Yes, I'm here. Sorry, I was muted.
Okay, so this is application 1I 2020 Secret Appeal Re 130 Beach Avenue. Okay, so is the applicant here and does he want to say anything? Let me just say one thing. Please do not repeat what you have said in the prior 2 meetings, because I will ask, and I have control now. I mean, Mr. Cutler has control of, if you're going to just repeat what you said, I'm going to ask him to mute you. We know what you previously said. If you have anything else to add, happy to hear it. Not happy to rehear everything you've said.
I'm only going to speak about been submitted since the last meeting.
Perfect. Excellent.
I've read and believe Mr. Salonitro's submissions of the historic records are important to the board's decision on this matter. While I have disagreements with his accompanying letter, he is entitled to his opinion. I don't believe I had ever read the transcript of the 1986 ZBA meeting, and it refreshed a lot of memories. I would like to comment on a couple things that I believe are relevant. Page 2 of the 1986 Notice of Appeal states that there were 2 COs at the time. I provided the 1941 CO to the board at the last meeting. I believe the 1948 CO may well be the CO issued when the main houses was converted, 2 families, but apparently is missing at this time. I was also reminded that I don't believe I ever made clear to the board that the current configuration of my 3rd floor is not what the 1986 Notice of Appeal was for. Plan in 1986 to the ZBA involves structural changes to the 3rd floor with a 50% increase in square footage. Mr. Tavolanti stated in his January 3rd letter to the board that, quote, it appears that Mr. Tiekert has constructed the space to exactly what was denied by the previous zoning board. close quote. I did not, and I don't think I made that clear. As page 20 of the June 5th, 1986 ZBA minutes report, that STEM Associates architect informed the ZBA at that time that the quote, large house is a lovely house on a large lot. We are talking about a pitched roof that comes down too low and expanding it out. I would also like to ask that the board make a ruling on the applicability of the multiple dwelling law to this matter. None of the violations issued reference multiple dwelling law. The building department's last communication relied heavily on the violations of it. And that's all I have.
Okay. Ms. Mountain, did you want to say something? No?
Yes, thank you. Hi. So Mr. Teager is saying that multiple dwelling law was not mentioned in 1986. At that time, the village was not actually using that, the multiple dwelling law. So that would not have been applicable at that time. You know, whether there is a small change, a change in square footage that he says that he would have wanted to make, what he has done is essentially what was proposed at that time. So that really is the only comment that I would make, is that there really is no significant difference that I can see.
Okay. My only comment is, which is really to the board members, the issue before us tonight is not whether it is subject to the multiple dwelling law, and I don't think we have to or should be making that decision. The issue before us tonight is whether or not the configuration of Mr. Teichert's house and the rental of this space to a third party is in fact creation of a unit that would increase the degree of non-compliance, or in other way make it violate. It's not going to violate because it already violates the zoning code because it's got 3 families in there, but it's really a determination of whether or not this is adding an additional unit. And so I don't think a determination of, if in fact we determine that, then whether or not that makes it subject to the multiple dwelling law is something that the law decides, not something that we decide. So I don't think we should be making that determination. I don't have any questions for Mr. Teichert. Does anybody in the board have any questions for the applicant? Doug, you want to go?
I have a question for you, or a statement to you. Okay, the property is already 3 families.
I'm sorry, you're talking to me, Doug?
No, I'm talking to Robin.
Okay.
Robin, the property is already 3 families. So it already falls under the multiple dwelling law.
Okay.
And the multiple, and so I'm just making sure that we understand it is already 3 families. It falls under the multiple dwelling law.
Well,
so it has to be considered.
But it's not our job to consider the multiple dwelling law. And if we're going to consider whether it's a multiple dwelling, I mean, I've got the multiple dwelling law in front of me here. And I don't know the answer to that. I'll take your word for it without having done any research into it. But a dwelling is a building or structure. A multiple dwelling as a building or is a dwelling. Since a dwelling is a building or structure, a multiple dwelling would have to be a building or structure. Here we've got a 3-family property, no question about that. But whether or not, in fact, this building, the property has a multiple dwelling on it is a separate question. And I'm not sure why it matters to our decision today.
All right, no, what I'm saying is it's going to make a matter into determination of whether that is a dwelling unit itself. And the definition, and that's why I'm saying the multiple dwelling law is applicable, because it is, in fact, 3 families right now. It's not that, even though they're separate, they're on that lot and it's a 3-family. And the definitions and terms that you need to look at are within the confines of the multiple dwelling law.
Actually, I disagree, Doug. We are determining the applicability of our zoning code, and our zoning code has some definitions, however incomplete they might be. So the place to look is our zoning code for those definitions, not to look at the multiple dwelling law for those definitions.
Well, that's
And I note that the building code has additional definitions which also vary. The state
Okay.
building code, which is different and which
I
may or
am-
may not apply to this,
Okay.
and which part of the code would apply, is a different. So they're all different definitions. And the only one that we are concerned with is our village zoning.
Based on a non-conforming use.
Right.
Correct. But in order for you to make the determination that in effect, whether or not that non-conforming use has expanded is based on the applicable codes that are in place. And quote, we have the village code, we have the state code. And the state code is a relatively clear definition. You are a resident if you have 2 families or less. You fall under the building code if you are in excess of 2 families. That's the code. The village code, when you look at it, any project that comes before us, regardless of whether the zoning piece or not, how many times did we look at the code in relationship to other applications that came before us? Quite a few. So I'm saying whatever we conclude, okay, we need to make sure that we make a determination based on all of the available information in front of us. And that includes every code. Because and I will only say this in the terms of building codes are strictly minimal requirements for life safety. You can ask any building official. Those are the codes. And that's why I'm saying we need to keep that in mind in any determination we make with respect to any application before us.
Frank, I have a question for you, or Charlotte, one of the two of you. Has the village determined that this property that this house is a multiple dwelling?
Has the building department determined that?
Yes. In the building department's determination, this is a multiple dwelling?
Yes. Yes.
But this is a multiple dwelling under state law, under the
Yes.
multiple dwelling law.
Yes.
We have that documented, that decision?
As far as, you mean what prior boards said in their decision?
No, we don't care what prior boards have said. What is the building department? Because it's what prior boards have said is, I don't think they made a determination as to whether this was subject to the multiple dwelling law or some other law.
Well, I believe that is a multiple dwelling property. You have two residences in the main house that we now think is a third, and you have one over the garage. So to me, it's definitely a multiple dwelling.
But because it's 3 in the main house, and that's exactly what we are discussing
No,
now.
he's saying because it's 3 altogether, I think.
I thought he just said there's 3 in the main house and 1 in the gatehouse, so.
There's 3 if we allow this third occupant on the 3rd floor, there would be 3 in the main house, yes. And then 1 over the garage. You'd have 4 families.
But the question is, if it is not just, has the board determined, has the village building department determined, based on the configuration of that property as a 2-family and a 1-family, leave aside for a minute the issue of what this is. In that configuration, if it was a 2-family and a 1-family, which we know is a legal non-conforming use, is that a multiple dwelling?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Lori Lee, what, if any, powers, I don't know that it has any, but what, if any, powers does the board have with respect to the multiple dwelling law? None, I think, right? Just to use it as a I mean, we can look at it, of course, but
You have powers because you are tasked. The village has actually adopted the enforcement of the building codes, uniform codes, as its code for purposes of meeting minimum house standards and building standards. And the multiple dwelling law is among the codes that the village is tasked with enforcing. So part of the analysis, that, from what I understand in the record, the building department is asserting that this analysis would look to the multiple dwelling law in order to provide the appropriate definitions of dwelling, alteration, and those items that were highlighted in the actual violation notice. So you're not looking to interpret that. What you're looking at is a conglomeration. Is this a non-conforming use? And in order to determine that, you look to all of the evidence and the definitions of those codes that the building department is tasked with enforcing.
But first, then we would have to decide, because I don't actually necessarily agree, and that's why I want I was asking the building department. I don't necessarily agree that this is a multiple dwelling without that third family because of the definitions in the multiple dwelling law. So I think I had thought that we didn't have to get into it, but if what you're saying is we do, then I think that's the first discussion we're going to need to have among the board members as to whether or not this property, the multiple dwelling law applies here. That doesn't change the fact of whether under the zoning code it's a three-family house. Two very separate sets of definitions and two very separate sets of laws. It could be a three-family house. It could be a three-family property, if you will, without being subject to the multiple dwelling law because of the way the definitions vary in all of the different codes. So I think that would be the first. I mean, I think we have to, I mean, what you're saying.
Are you suggesting that because it's two separate buildings on one property?
Under the definitions in the multiple dwelling law, that's correct.
Oh, that's all right. I just wanted to clarify that's what you're getting at.
Charlotte, do you want to say something? I don't know.
Yes, thank you. Excuse me. Under either definition, my feeling was that that first structure, 130 Beach Avenue, is now being used as a three-family house. Of course, we would have nothing that would document that, such as a certificate of occupancy or a building permit, because we could not issue that because the third unit has been installed illegally. But the way that the building is currently configured under any of the definitions, there are three separate units in the building.
Okay, so what you're saying is doesn't matter whether the property as a whole is a multiple dwelling right now, because assuming that this is a third unit, that would bring it under it would be a three-family under multiple dwelling. It would be a three-family under the local zoning. Okay. Any other questions? Sorry, something, and Meg or Brett, if there's anything.
Multiple dwellings law, are we still talking about multiple dwellings law?
We're talking about the applicability of the we've been talking about the applicability of the multiple dwelling.
I know, are we still talking about, I mean, I believe the definition says it has to be in a building, so we would have to determine if we really think this is three different units. And we haven't determined, our board has not determined yet whether we think it's three separate dwelling units. I don't think it falls under multiple dwelling because there's three on the property, the way I read the definition of multiple dwellings.
Right, I think our first question is, and I know, and I have to share the same as I think I've indicated that to me, I'm not sure. Without this third unit, I'm not sure there is a multiple dwelling on the property. With this third unit, there would be. So I guess since the question is that we're determining is whether or not there is in fact a third unit, that's what we're determining, whether or not there is in fact a third unit. I mean, I think that's our determination.
So can we move on to think about that? Are we going to
move our
We're not
discussion.
deciding it today. We're not, I mean, do you have something, you want to discuss it, please? I
Yeah,
wasn't
I want to
discussing that.
discuss the application, the material. I want to discuss
Third
the affidavit, and we've got the materials from the 1980s past resolutions. We've received both of those things since our last meeting. And I don't understand why it seems that the building department is saying that that Mr. Teekert actually followed what the plans were when they had applied to make it a 3 condo unit and got turned down. I'm looking at this and I'm seeing, I know Mr. Teekert just said he was going to expand the floor plan. We also see, and I'm reading here, that they intended to seal off the common staircase between the floors and add a separate entrance to the 3rd floor. That was part of the plans for making it a 3 separate unit, which they got turned down for. And so obviously that didn't happen. But what I'm seeing is that was what it's actually not just Mr. Teekert, it was the STEM group. That was their thought when they thought they were going to make it 3 separate apartments. So I don't know how everybody feels about the fact that there's one stairway in this and there's a door at the top of it, but for sure they did not go through with the plans that they had described in the 1980s to make these 3 separate units. And that was very helpful from the materials that we just received. And I would like to speak to the affidavit that we received from the boarder. I was very interested to see that he has freedom to use the kitchen whenever he wants, freedom to use all the other spaces, uses the lawn area. To me, it's definitely a roommate kind of situation. And not to repeat, it doesn't have a lease. He's not paying insurance on that space. If they had boarded off the stairway and had a separate door to go to the 3rd floor, I could see how other things would come into play. You would lease it out with a formal lease that you would have to ask that occupant to carry insurance probably. That's generally what happens, but this is a much more informal situation.
They actually did.
I have to say that I don't think the fact that if you go into a townhouse in much of the world, there's one staircase in the building. There's one staircase that goes up. Somebody gets off at the 1st floor, that's their apartment. Somebody gets off at the 2nd floor, that's their apartment. The existence of a common staircase does not mean it's not
right. I just was pointing out that I was just pointing out people are saying that Mr. Teekert then constructed what he had asked for, and he did not do that.
Okay. Before we go, does anybody from the public wish to address this application? I'm sorry, does anyone else from the board want to just ask Mr. Teekert or talk about what we've talked about so far? No, so.
I just want to make one statement, and that is when I read the affidavit by Mr. Steinkamp, he referenced working in Judge Gallagher's chambers, and I'm married to Judge Gallagher. So I just, for sake of transparency, I asked my husband whether he knew him, and my husband doesn't recall meeting him, doesn't recall who he is. So I don't think there's a conflict, but I just bring that up so there's no question about that.
Thank you. Okay, does any member of the public wish to address this application?
And please use the raise a hand feature. It should be on your screen. It'll let me know that you'd like to speak on the application. Alternatively, you can send me an email at gcutler@vomny.org. I've got one. There we go. Okay, you should be able to speak now.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, this is Benny Salanitro. I sent the board documents from the 1985, 1986 Board of Appeals application that STEM Associates had made. I hope the board finds that useful. I have been following this application as I've been following other applications that the zoning board has before it. I felt compelled to supply this information because to me, it should make the job of the board extremely easy. And I just wanted to compliment Mrs. Mountain and Mr. Tavolacci for their fine work, because clearly, I don't care how, in my view, you can put the lipstick on the pig, it's still a pig. I appreciate Meg and Greta helping clarify their position relative to the current use, but the history on this property is full of valuable information that supports, unequivocally, in my view, supports the building department's position. Firstly, the timeline of STEM Associates from their acquisition in December of '84, and within 6 to 7 months thereafter, they sought a use variance. So this is an R5 district, and an application was made for a use variance. Those are almost impossible to get, but they got a use variance to convert the garage to further conforming use to convert the gatehouse to what we know now as a larger single family use, separate from the rest of the house. Then 6 months later, I use the term double down, since the first use variance was rather easy to get. They went back for a second use variance. And to me, what's telling about that, not to glance over it, is that it was further aggravation to the neighborhood, to the fact that this is now an application for a 4-family use. I disagree with Meg, because I believe that they in fact did exactly without the roof renovations, they did in fact create an interior separate stairwell to the upper floor. That was clearly mentioned by Ms. Mountain in the first application, in the first hearing. So there is a separate entrance. There was a wall that divides the staircase from Mr. Tika's residence to the unit above him. There's clearly a second use, a third use, if you will, in that primary dwelling. What bothers me, a lot of things bother me about this application, but it's an application for an interpretation and an appeal of violations issued by the building department. I fear that this will backdoor a variance that this is once asked for. I don't care how you slice it, in my view, this is not an application for a variance. This is an application for an interpretation and / for the violations to be reconsidered as appropriate or not. If the board goes down a slippery slope by suggesting that it's okay for him to have this second or this other tenancy, and I don't believe the paper that you got from the affidavit is worth anything, because look at the history on this property. People change, things change. A single person can go to a family. These are families, it's a single family zone. So I really believe that it's incumbent upon the board to recognize and also to understand where we go from here. In this single family zone, which I reside in,
It'll be recorded.
I pay $34,000 a year in taxes. I reside here with my family. My house is big enough to have an occupant to help subsidize that. And I don't know whether the message being sent here, and to Doug's commentary, whether this is multifamily law or the other building code, it doesn't matter. As a single family residential zone, we're not permitted to have other inhabitants, regardless of whether there's a stove or not. Nobody uses stoves today anyway, because there's other mechanisms out there to provide heating of food and cooking of food. Can I rent my basement? Can I rent something out of my house? Can other families? I mean, we're living in an economic time right now where people will look to these type of decisions of the zoning board, in my view, and say, wait, if Mr. Teekert can do this, why can't I? The code enforcement officers are charged to ensure the safety of the general public, in my view. And there's a lot of overcrowding. People are renting individual rooms, which is wrong. What gives the right to this application, it's not an application for its use, but what gives the person a right to further use residents or increase the number of residents in the home? I just think it's so unfair. I really, really do. Meg, I disagree with you. There is a separate constructed wall that goes up to the 4th floor. Those pictures were provided to the board. So
Also, our code does allow for people to have borders, for sure. You said, if you wanted to rent a room, our code does say that people can have a border. We're trying, if this is a border or if this is a separate dwelling unit, but you do have the
So
right.
it becomes a linguistic argument as to whether it's a tenant or a border. If you give somebody the opportunity to call it something that gives them what they want, they're going to call it what you say it is. Borders, tenants, whatever you want to call it. If he's receiving rent, he is subsidizing on the backs of others in this community in the single family zone. If you get the minutes back in 1985 and 1986, where residents spoke out against the application, they were very, very clear that their homes were equally as large, yet they did not seek to divide their homes into more than one family. They left it alone. This is not that. Call it so you're saying that we can all have borders in our homes. Is that what we're up against now? We can all have borders? That is a slippery slope. And
Just saying that's in the code. It's in the code.
It's not in the code the way you're saying it's in the code. That I disagree with that. And this has been used since 1986 as a separate apartment. He first used it obviously for his own family, which is permissive, and with that, God bless. But then, you start going down where, okay, it's, who's to have a single person living there? Can you have 3 boarders living there? Can you have 4 boarders living there? So that's why I say, to me, it's a difficult thing to talk about, that you're allowed to have borders. I don't think this is what was printed by the code. And I think it's a backdoor way of granting somebody an illegal use of a facility that they tried to get permission for and was denied. And this is the second way of doing it. There are a lot of people out there looking for help and they come to the zoning board. I don't think we have to bend over backwards on this one. They've reaped the benefits of the zoning code, of the zoning board with use variances in a single family zone. Enough is enough. They should say thank you and move on, not to keep asking. To me, that's rude and obnoxious. It's not the spirit of the Village of Mamaroneck. I've been living here 30 years. I'm a professional. I understand the code. I've been before your board many times, so I understand what's at stake. And I hear real estate agents coming up and speaking about other places, other homes that have third stories, or they have a door going up to the attic. You know what? Enforcement is enforcement. This comes down to the enforcement issues that have been strenuously gone after by our code enforcement. I applaud them for it. I can answer any questions you may have, but that's all I have to say at this moment.
Thank you. Does anyone else from the public wish to address this application?
Robin, Charlotte also made a very important point today. She said that this board has to consider what's going to happen to this apartment should you approve it, say 5 years down the road, when the occupants that are there now or may not be there anymore. And you could have families in there. You could have kids in there, 3 kids on the 3rd floor, 2 kids on the 2nd floor. It's more cars. It's just too much for a single family residence, that zone.
Thank you. So if no one else from the public wishes to speak, Stuart, Mr. Teaker, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, am I on?
Yeah. Oh, I hear you.
Yes.
So yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a reasonable discussion. I think you need some more information, perhaps. It does seem like the only, as I understand how our zoning code is written, the only way my 3rd floor qualifies as a dwelling unit is perhaps under multiple dwellings law. So I do think the multiple dwellings law issue should be resolved by the board before you move forward. That's all. Thanks.
Okay, board members, do we need any additional information? Do we want anything else before we close this application? Do we want to think about it and not close it now to go through everything and think about whether or not we want additional information? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Adjourn it.
You want to
Push it to
adjourn,
the-
not close, Doug?
Right, I don't want it closed. I
Okay,
want to adjourn it. I want to go back and review all the data. I want to absorb all the data.
okay. Unless anyone else disagrees, that's fine. That's fine. I didn't know what anyone else thought. That's okay. So we'll adjourn this.
I make a motion.
We don't need a motion. We'll just adjourn it.
Okay, okay,
We need a motion to close, but not to adjourn.
okay.
Okay, so this is adjourned. So,
Can you just add in the record when your next meeting date is, because the law does say adjourn to a date.
oh, what's the date, Betty Ann?
Our next meeting is May 7th.
Thank you, Betty Ann.
Okay, so we are adjourned on this matter is adjourned until the May 7th meeting. Okay, going back to the calendar. So the next application is 2A 2020 Paterno for 606 Rockland Avenue.
Hey, Robin, should I think should I mute myself? Like, what should I do? How do I know when it's over? I think I need to recuse myself.
So
I
you're
can mute
leaving
you.
the
if-
meeting, or are you leaving the meeting, or just recusing yourself on this application? Oh, right, you have to recuse yourself on this application. I think that since Greg, you have control of both the video and the microphone, can you mute Abby until this application is complete, because she had a relationship with the applicant and has to be recused?
Yep, sure.
I think that's okay, because just like you could be a member of the public listening in. So that's okay. So you now are a member of the public for this purpose. I think that should work, unless Christy thinks we need to do something else.
You need to bring Christy back, I think. She's still.
I just unmuted her. Christy, you should be able to participate.
Greg, my video is okay.
There you go.
Okay, so just, do you think we need to do anything else, or that works?
No, I think it's fine if we keep her on exactly what I just did. I was recused and it was muted and video stopped.
Fine. Okay, so that's done. Okay, Mr. Paterno, if you are here.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. To take off from last meeting, you asked us to clarify the plot plan with all the dimensions in the front yard. We have done that. The setback for the proposed covered porch comes to 19 foot 5 inches, which is a 7-inch projection into the required front yard. And that is really the clarification, along with the dimensions to the dwelling and the proposed addition. The proposed addition, the garage, all are within the envelope of the setbacks. The proposed covered porch is within the envelope of the setback, except on the right corner, which is at 19 foot 5, 7-inch projection. Thank you.
I have a question for you, Mr. Paterno, which is, what is to your east? What is vacant, what now looks like vacant land? Do you know what that land, who owns it, or what kind of, or
Yes.
anything about it?
Yes, it's owned by the county. It's more of a retention area for the Sheldrake River.
It's what?
Like a retention area for the Sheldrake River.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Does anybody else on the board have questions for the applicant? Okay, does anybody from the public wish to address this application?
Anything, Greg?
I have nothing.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
You can also email me. I'm going to repeat this every time just in case someone is watching on YouTube or LMC TV. You can email me at gcutler@vomny.org, gcutler@vomny.org.
Okay, if no one has anything, should we close this? Does someone else want to get, does anyone on the board want to get any additional information, or shall we ready to close?
I'll make a motion, we close.
Anyone else?
I second the motion.
Okay, and Greta,
Yes.
Doug, yes.
Yes.
I vote yes, and Meg?
Yes.
Okay, so this application is closed.
Thank you.
Application 3SP 2020 Marco Variale for Padre P. Osteria, 501 Halsted Avenue.
Just give me one moment to get everybody set. It was easy for Joe because he was just in person.
The next item on the agenda, I'm sorry, you're correct.
Mark, do you have anybody else that's on this application?
Marco, I don't know if Marco is on or not. Marco.
Okay, I see him. Yep.
But you can hear me, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And Marco should be able to speak now.
Okay.
Yes, I am online.
Okay, Greg, do you want to allow me to show my screen?
Yeah, I have tried a couple times. There we go. It should work now.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you again for having the meeting and doing this. Greg, you can see the screen?
No, you have to click share screen at the bottom.
Okay, hold on a second. There it is.
And then choose the screen you want to share if you have more than one screen. If you only have one screen, just click share. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So following the last meeting, we did some research to try and find evidence that this use does predate the 1968 date. And so this was submitted to you. This was something that the owner's attorney found from when he researched his records when the owner was buying the building, that this is showing there was a bar restaurant in July of 1933. And then following this again in the permit history, again in July of 33, showing that it was an operation of a bar or restaurant. And then, so Mark and I are both been trying to do additional research to find more information. Let me just see, this I found, these are old assessment cards from the Town of Rye's assessment. I'm just going to scroll down here. I know this is kind of hard to read, but in this area right here, it describes the space as a tavern. And then there's another drawing here. This is upside down, but it describes it again as a tavern. I can't find on these cards the records of when these were drawn. They appear to be rather old, but I don't know for sure. And I haven't been able to get a hold of anybody at the Town of Rye assessor's office. This is the Village of Mamaroneck assessment card, which again does not date when these drawings were done. But this again shows this as a tavern.
Mark, back up, please. One slide.
Nope. Hold on, let me see if I can find it. No, you want the one from the Town of Rye, correct?
No, I want the one previous to this one.
Yeah, I'm looking for it.
I think he wants you to just scroll up.
Yeah, just scroll up one.
Yeah.
All right, hold on.
No, he needs the one before that, because this is the
am-
Village of Mamaroneck one. You wanted the one
Right.
before that.
Okay, I see things here saying 274, 576, and 878.
Uh-huh.
I guess, you see them up on the left-hand corner?
You see the one,
that's
Anthony Del
change in
the
ownership.
top one from 60,000
Right.
has no date.
Um,
That, the one above that has no date.
no, I see that. No, I understand it. I'm just looking at, and these say, there's a change of ownership, obviously, in those 3
Right.
years, 74,
You can- here
76,
they list-
78.
You see
Okay,
it's a
now
beauty
what?
shop, tavern, and at that point it was a decorator.
Right, okay, so it does show tavern, 72, 70, 74, 76, 78, okay.
Yes. So again, we've also tried to look at, I tried to research the daily item records to see if I could find anything that referenced the address or the tied in, which we know was there. I wasn't able to find anything. Marco tried to go to the historical society, but again, I think with what's going on socially, he wasn't able to really get anywhere with it.
Right.
But if I can show you anything else or answer any other questions, I'd be happy to.
Yeah. No,
Does anybody?
oh,
go ahead, Doug.
I have a question.
Okay.
This is what, La Familia, right?
This was Fiamma.
Right on the what?
This was Fiamma, yeah, the last use was
Yeah,
Fiamma.
Fiamma, right.
Right.
When did Fiamma cease operation?
I believe, I'm not really sure, actually. Let me take a look here. I'm going to go through, I'm scrolling through the application because in here is the special permit that was denied for the pizzeria.
Mm-hmm.
So this is going to take a little while, but let's see.
No, it's all right.
I'll keep going, but go ahead.
Here's my question.
Okay.
Okay. Did it cease more than 6 months ago?
Yes.
Okay. If I am not mistaken, and maybe the village attorney can correct me, if an operation ceases more than 6 months, it no longer considered what that operation was.
That's for if it's a non-conforming
It's not a
use.
non-conforming use. It requires a special permit. It's not
Okay.
non-conforming.
Okay. I need clarification on that. Is that correct? Which section of the code does it say that it has to be a non-conforming to,
It actually doesn't matter whether this was a,
No,
I mean, it was a restaurant, but in other words, if this was just an empty space and it was a barber shop before, and now he wanted a restaurant, he'd have to apply for a special permit.
right, okay.
That's what he's doing.
Yeah, all right.
I believe it's 34263, non-conforming use of land.
And that's the only place it is in there, Greg? It's not in the initial code somewhere other than zoning?
Why Doug would,
You remember we had the discussion on parking? And we said, well, it's an existing use.
we said
Okay,
it was a
and
pre-existing
I
use
just
that
wanna
didn't
make
need it.
sure- I just want to make sure that it doesn't fall under that 6-month rule on any determination that we make.
That 6-month rule does not apply to non-conformity other than use, which is the next section down. That's 34265. And I think
Okay.
the section you're talking about is in the parking schedule, or it's the section right before schedule of off-street parking
Right, okay,
with respect to uses before April 1, 1968.
okay,
Structures and land uses.
right. Now, I remember we had an someone from the audience was talking about insufficient parking.
Sorry,
on the
can I
last,
say something?
Excuse me?
I'm sorry, can I speak? Can somebody hear me?
Yeah, hold on one second. And I wanted to, and I know they showed a parking lot. Mark, did you put dimensions on those, on those spaces in that
I did not, no.
You didn't, okay.
No, I did a really just a diagrammatical layout to show how
Right.
cars could be parked.
Okay, yeah, no, the reason why I'm asking the question is because, yeah, there's a layout sitting up right over in there.
Those are all 9-foot wide spaces.
I understand, but you recognize that employee parking only has to be 8'6" wide.
Well, I laid them out at 9.
Right, I understand that. Okay,
And I tried to show a reasonable way of cars that could fit on there if needed, basically.
all right, so you have you have 10 cars.
You have 9, right?
9? 5, 6, yeah,
Oh, you're
9
right, I have
9
10.
vehicles.
You have 10.
And you need what, 12?
If we had to comply with the zoning, we would need 11.
11. So you're talking two spaces.
If we needed to comply, yes.
Right, okay.
And the
just
reason we
by way
showed-
of,
And the only reason we showed parking was because he is the only tenant that has in his lease that he
Parking,
has the
yeah.
right to use it. So I just wanted to, that's why we just wanted to show that we do have the right to do something there.
Right, right. No, I understand, Mark. I'm just, making sure that we have all of the information that we need.
Sure.
I may make a comment. I just want to be clear that in the past, the building department has considered situations like this to be exempt from the parking requirements. And that's because so many buildings in this village are non-compliant and non-conforming and were built before the zoning code existed. And many businesses exist within those spaces and do not have the requisite parking. We're not expecting everyone to be able to do that to
But
accommodate.
is it, Greg, is it also necessary that the use did not change? We understand that they were in use that way before the parking requirement, so they're not, as long as they stay with that same use.
As long as there's no increase in the use, in the requirements with the new use.
And when you're looking at this kind of situation, are you looking at when, according to our parking regulations, it would have been the whole lot is sharing the lot? Are we looking at whether or not all of the uses have been the same and have not increased in impact? I don't believe we have a consistent record for knowing whether or not the space was a restaurant or a tavern, or if a tavern is the same as a restaurant. But I also know that there's other uses. And according to, if it was a space that has been built and it had to conform with our parking regulations now, we would have to figure out how many, it would be a parking lot that's supporting all of those different uses. And I'm looking at the property record that we just saw from, it's hard to tell the date, but it was up on the screen. If you also need, it looks like this one.
The one from Amerenik or the one from?
This is the property assessment record, Town of Rye.
Hang on 1 second. Somehow
It's this one. And I can share it, but you have it on yours. And I'm looking, it says beauty shop, tavern, decorator, and a 4-room apartment. It looks like an apartment. And if they split it up into 3 apartments and they have different uses in the other spaces of the building, isn't that could we consider that as having more impact on the parking, putting greater demand on the parking? Is it just one use that we're looking at, or the totality of the uses?
It's just the use that we're looking at, but if the building department did not require, when it changed the use, that it provide parking, then you would have to be first making a determination that those uses should not be permitted.
Yeah, I also just
said if it increased the demand of parking.
But this use isn't in, this use that we're dealing with today, and all we're dealing with today is this particular restaurant use. So the only question is, does this particular restaurant use, so if he were doubling the size of this restaurant use, would that be, expands the existing nonconformity, possibly because it would make more restaurant space and therefore more non-conforming? We're not dealing with, this use doesn't do anything to the existing non-conformity. And if none of the other spaces, units rental spaces have the right to use the parking, then it's moot anyway, because since they don't have the right to use the parking, they couldn't use the parking and it couldn't ever have been counted, and we don't even, and there would be no reason that we would have to consider them. But
They are uses that require parking, and
But
so.
we're not dealing with them today. And they don't have a right to use the parking lot, and they were permitted to exist without any parking. So if we were to say that because the uses have changed since the 1967, let's say, right? That was pre-68. If we're saying that the uses have changed since 1967, and therefore there's an increased demand for parking, but they didn't have the right to use this lot in the first place, and the building inspector did not require that they provide parking spaces, I don't see how we could say that there's a change or an increase in use.
Okay, how do we know in 1968 that they didn't have the use of the parking lot? We're understanding now that this is the only space that has the lease that says they can use the parking lot. How do we know whether or not the other uses had the right to use the apartment in those, when that somebody rented the apartment before?
Is there a C of O, Greg, for this building?
Yeah, there's multiple C of Os.
And do any of them talk about parking?
I don't believe so. They're all attached to the application. I don't believe any of them address parking.
The C of O's
Okay,
usually
so-
talk about parking? Do they talk about parking?
I
in
don't
their
think
C
they
of O?
generally do.
Was there a zoning compliance done for this, Frank?
I believe so. Originally, yes.
Yes.
And,
Yeah, these are the
and,
copies of the COs. I don't think any of them mention parking, frankly.
Mark, while you're scrolling up,
Uh-huh.
go stop at that parking lot layout again, please.
Can we zoom in on that?
No, it's fine. I have a good view.
Okay.
Doug, I'm going to interject. I'm sorry. I think you're about to say something. So let me just, while you're looking at that, I think people have driven by. We've all seen that there's generally 4 or 5 cars in the parking lot most of the time that I'm driving by there. So is the landlord going to make sure that nobody else parks there when this restaurant is used? Is it actually going to enforce the fact that it's going to stay empty for the use of this space that's empty right now? So it's obviously not cars that go for this business, but quite a number of cars are always there. Is that the landlord's intent, to make sure it's dedicated to the restaurant?
Marco, you want to address that, or is Marco there?
Yes, can I speak?
Yes.
Hi, how are you? Marco Variale, nice to meet you. Only one thing I want to say. Unfortunately, nobody in the contract have the right for parking the parking lot. The parking lot is exclusivity for the restaurant in the restaurant business area. Nobody have in the contract the right for the parking, because the landlord never give to somebody the right for parking inside. Also, we, like a restaurant, we're gonna pay for insurance for the parking lot. So we are responsible for the parking lot in everything. So this is what I mean. The restaurant is always been a restaurant, or a tavern less restaurant. Anyway, it's always the same size. Nobody before me have the parking lot. Nobody have in the contract. We are the only contract with the right to parking inside. The landlord already provided to tell everybody we have the right for parking inside. But I don't think he sent some paper to somebody. This I don't know. But we are the only one. Is right also in our contract, in our leasing contract. So the parking lot is our parking lot.
The contract that you provided, or the pages from the contract you provided, didn't, as I recall, didn't explicitly say that it was exclusive to you. Could you provide us with some evidence that shows that indeed this parking lot is exclusive to your use only?
Yes, it's in the leasing contract. I think in the.
I didn't see the word. I didn't see the word. You know, can you show me in the contract where it says that it's exclusive to you?
Mr. Marco, you can do?
I'm gonna take a look at my records here. It's easier, then I can go through the scroll.
But yes, I'm sure it's right in the contract because we signed the contract with this reason, because without the parking lot, we are sure we don't have the approval for the town. So I make sure with my lawyer and the landlord, we have the parking lot in the contract with the exclusive use. And also I repeat myself, but I wanna say the place, it's always been a restaurant. It can be only a restaurant. And the problem of the parking is here, was in the past, is in the future. We don't change almost nothing.
I do want to say also that the special permit for Fiamma was granted without their having the right to the parking.
Yeah, this is what I
As
mean.
far as we see it, this is an improvement.
No restaurant or no people was before have the right for parking. We are the only one, the first one in the story of the building. So I think we have just a plus.
Okay, well, if you could just show me the language, I didn't.
It says
see
they
it.
have the use of the parking lot during business hours. Customers shall not park vehicles in the lot overnight, and tenant must include the parking lot area in its liability insurance policy coverage.
Okay, well, it doesn't say it's
It doesn't say that
exclusive.
that it excludes everybody else, but they do have, the landlord does not allow it for other people. Other people do not have it in their lease.
But still, it's our parking lot. It's just the right exclusive, but it's me next to my lawyer.
Again, they are responsible
for
for it. They have to provide the insurance for it.
Yep.
So
And
really,
also I remember last meeting, you don't give me a problem for the parking too much. You tell me just you want to prove this was a restaurant before. The whole proof, I can find it, I give to you. Also, I spoke with Mr. Pritz and Mr. Tripicco, sorry for my accent, and for the Historical Society of Mamaroneck. And both tell me, unfortunately, they don't have no record about the restaurant, but their memory can tell me it's a restaurant or tavern in the last 30 years at least. So everybody know was a restaurant, everybody know what was before. Also, the people from the city spoke in last meeting, I forgot the name of the guy, he tell everybody was always a restaurant. The concept of the people is if we make a mess, if you put a loud music, or if we have a problem with the parking because they don't like have a pizzeria, but we have just a fine seat restaurant. It's not very big, we don't have too much seat, so we are able to handle it with the parking spot we have, I think so. And this is the only way for open a business over there, if I understand. Or they have to change everything, I don't know what happened. But it's always been a restaurant, I think it's gonna be a restaurant for the rest of the property life. Thank you.
Hey, Mark?
Yes.
It's Doug. Do me a favor, scroll down to that parking lot layout again, please. And what I'd like you to do is zoom it in. I want to see what's in front of those stairs.
Okay, hold on. So the stairs come down and they have access to the.
Existing French trash enclosure. Okay, I
Yes,
just wanted to
yes,
see
that's
that.
what that is.
Okay,
Yeah.
and I know you just put it on there to show that you can get vehicles there. I mean, you didn't go into a full parking lot study at all. I
I did make
understand.
them all 9 feet wide.
Excuse me?
I did make all the spaces 9 feet wide, which is.
Yeah, and you know that you can make them, at least the employee parking spaces smaller. Okay, and you could probably, seriously, I really think you could pick up another space if you looked at it really, and I understand. But, you know, I mean, we're talking 2 spaces.
Well, the other thing is, I think if they're wildly successful, they would, which I'm sure they hope they are, they could even, do valet and stack people's cars if they need to. If they
Right.
really don't have that
No,
much seating, so I don't know if I ever get there, but.
No, I understand. I understand. I was just looking at that enclosed trash enclosure section. You know, I mean, if that were moved over to where that diagonal car was against the
yeah,
rubbish bin, if you took that out of there and put it over there, you got another space.
Yes, yep. That's
And
true.
it wouldn't impede the vehicles backing out, and it wouldn't impede the access to those stairs either. So, you know, I mean, there, you know, that puts 10. So.
Well, again,
Okay, I appreciate it. I appreciate zooming in, Mark. Thanks.
Sure. Okay.
Does anybody else have any questions or anything of the applicant? Do we need, anybody looking for more information, or are we ready to close?
I have the information I need.
Greta or Meg, do either of you need anything else? Okay, Abby, I don't know if you're there.
I'm here.
Do you need anything else?
Nope.
Okay, so then I think we can close.
I'll make that motion.
I'll second it. Greta?
Yes.
Meg?
Yes.
Abby?
Yes.
Doug?
Yes.
And I vote yes. Okay, so this is also closed.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.